the feminine Neteru, who represents the balance and harmony, the cause and effect forces that permeate not just Kemet, but the entire planet, and by extension, the entire universe. These forces are forces that govern everything that was known to man. So we find from this system of law and the 42 declarations of innocence, which some may regard as laws, the first codified system of jurisprudence. Right? But we also see that from the symbol of Ma'at and the scale, we get the symbol of justice and the scale of justice that we see in courts in the United States and throughout the world. We see that in the American interpretation of Ma'at, justice is blind. Supposedly, justice is blind, but as Dr. Ben frequently says, we find people of African ancestry go to court, and we find justice means that it's just us who's in court, and we're being held accountable for laws written by Europeans that are designed specifically to incarcerate and to punish people of African ancestry. So the world as we know it, or the laws that were created by African people, have literally been turned upside down, and now are used to imprison or to minimize the development and growth of people of African ancestry. We also find in a document, which I believe is the Papyrus of Hunefer, at that scene of the weighing of the soul, Heru and 12 Neteru sitting in judgment of the deceased. So this is where we get the concept of the judge and the 12 people in the jury. So if we understand Kemetic history and the images associated with Kemetic history, we then can use that understanding to see how others have benefited, oftentimes without acknowledging the source of these concepts, but they have benefited from knowledge that has come from the Nile Valley. So that's one example of African law being used throughout the world without acknowledgement of the African origins.
Now, were everybody subject to this standard of justice, even the pharaohs, or was it today? I mean, if you got some money, you don't have to obey the law. You can usurp and manipulate. So how was that culture?
Well, let's be realistic in terms of our understanding of Kemetic culture and civilization. They were human beings, just like you and I. They had the same basic needs, same basic desires, and so they had the same frailties that we as human beings have. But they had systems in place in order to minimize certain behavior. There are a number of legal documents that I've seen that deal with transgressions that you would see in almost any court today. There were people who were contesting wages, unfair payment of wages. There were people who were contesting property that was stolen, people who had disputes over land. As a matter of fact, the oldest document regarding a divorce is a Kemetic document. And in that particular document, we see that the woman, the female in that relationship, was awarded property and other items because not just because she was a woman, but because of the fact that the charges that she brought against her husband were true and just. So we find that women were treated fairly in African law, something that women in European society and American society didn't gain that privilege until probably the late 18th or early 19th century. So Kemet law and society was ahead of Western law and society on many different levels. There are instances where merchants had claims against each other, and those issues were resolved in a court of law. So I guess I would say that the law applied to everyone, and that those who had a reasonable case could have their case tried in a court of law. and in many instances, those laws were favorably applied to all people.
But did they have like policemen? How was law um, executed and carried out? I mean,
Well,
do you know?
I can't say specifically, but I can surmise that since Kemet had a military force, they had soldiers, um, then by extension, they would have some form of militia. They would have some form of what we would classify today as a police force in order to maintain order and stability. We see, if we look at what Dr. Hilliard has referred to as the 4 golden ages of ancient Kemet, we find that each of those 4 golden ages was interrupted by a period of internal strife, an intermediate era. And in the first intermediate era, we find that Kemet was subjected to internal strife, political strife. There was confusion, chaos, and disorder throughout the land. So obviously something happened. I'm not quite sure what that thing was, but something happened that led to the breakdown of society on all levels. I've read some documents that were written during this time frame, during the first intermediate period, and you would swear that it came straight from the headlines of the Washington Post or the New York Times. People lamenting the fact that there's no love between neighbors, that it's not safe for women to walk outside, that people are being robbed, and there is confusion, there is instability. So while I don't know personally what the source of that confusion was, we do know that the first intermediate period came to an end as a result of the second golden age, the 11th and 12th dynasty, which ushered in the period in which the great wisdom texts of Kemet were all written. That's the literary period in Kemetic history. So we find that out of that period of strife and turmoil came texts, came laws, came knowledge that helped to put people of Kemet back on the path of Ma'at, the straight line, and help align them to a system of order and consciousness. And they were able to maintain that direction until the second intermediate period, when Kemet was invaded for the first time by foreign rulers, the so-called Hyksos, or shepherd kings.
Now, they were coming from where and who were they?
Well, that issue has been debated, but it's generally believed that they were people who came from the region that is now referred to as the Middle East. There are some who contend that some of these people, some of these shepherd kings, may have come from Mesopotamia.
But they would have still been African people.
Well, that issue is being debated. There are some who believe that these people were classified as Asiatics, and they were depicted as people who were physically different from the Kemites or the Cushites. They had beards. They wore different style clothing. So we know that they were a so-called different race of people. In the tomb of Ramesses the third, for example, there's the depiction of the 4 different races as determined by the Kemite people. You had the Libyan people, who lived west of Kemet. You had the Kemetic people themselves. You had the Cushite people, who were similar in appearance, that is, dark-skinned in appearance. Their clothing was somewhat different, but they were essentially the same people. And then you had classified as the 4th race, the Asiatics, of whom the Hyksos, we can assume, were of that group. And there are some who believe that it was during the time of the Hyksos invasion that the people who are now classified as Hebrews or Jews came into Kemet. And what's also important about that period in Kemetic history is that these foreign invaders, these foreign kings, only controlled Lower Kemet, the Delta region of Kemet, that part of Northeast Africa that is closer to the so-called Middle East. They never gained control of Upper Kemet, which remained in the hands of indigenous African people. And as Dr. Hilliard pointed out, it was always the indigenous African rulers from the south, from Upper Kemet, who were responsible for rallying the forces and driving out all of the invaders and restoring normalcy or reuniting the two lands of Kemet. So that happened with the Second Golden Age, the 11th and 12th dynasties. That happened during the Third Golden Age, the 18th and 19th dynasty. And it also happened during the Fourth and final Golden Age, which was the 25th dynasty. So we have a clear and consistent pattern of the unification of Kemet always coming from the south, always being spearheaded by indigenous African people who were guided by their philosophical beliefs, their understanding of the laws of Ma'at, and their religious beliefs, which were associated with Asar, Aset, Heru, Re, Amun-Re, and Kep-Re. So the spiritual foundation of Kemet, which allowed this nation to exist and to thrive for 3,000 years, came from the south, originated in the south, and was a cornerstone and the bedrock of Kemetic culture and civilization.
I was trying not to over-romanticize
Sure.
Africa, because I think that too is a mistake that we make. So I wanted to try to get a view from your research, from your study, that gave a more accurate depiction of a society that was involved with many of the problems that we have today.
Sure.
So you were talking about the second golden age and the third golden age. I didn't know whether you wanted to add more to that, because you dealt with the third and the fourth golden age in that brief summation. But was there more that you were pointing out? You know, we're dealing with culture.
Sure.
And the values of the society.
Well, we can say that the first golden age, dynasties 3 through 6, was the age in which all of the great pyramids were built. And if we use Dr. Hilliard's terminology, the Kemetic word for pyramid is mir. Pyramid is a Greek word. It means little flat cake, like a pancake. And it was a term that was used by the Greek in order to disparage the architectural accomplishments of the ancient Kemites. The word mir is a more appropriate word, because mir in the Kemetic language means the place of ascension. So if we think of the use of these structures, these so-called pyramidal shaped structures, they were edifices where a king or queen was buried underneath that structure. There's no evidence of a person being buried inside of the structure. They were always buried underneath. And that vehicle was the vehicle which allowed for the spirit of that person to ascend into the heavens, to take their place among the stars with the star, so that they will become a star. We see that wonderfully executed in the pyramid of Abu Nas, where in his burial chamber, which is beneath his pyramid, we see 5-pointed stars painted on the ceiling. Okay, we see up from there. We see in the pyramid of Unas, in his burial chamber, 5-pointed stars carved on the ceilings. We see in the text which came to be known as the pyramid text, which is some of the oldest sacred texts in Kemet, statements of Asar, his soul being weighed on the scale of Ma'at, in the hall of Ma'at, truth and justice, and him being found Ma'at, Keru, and then taking his place in the heavens and becoming a star, dwelling, his spirit dwelling in the heavens. And so the mir then, and that term is very important once we understand this context in which it was used. So the mir is the place where the soul ascended into heaven. There are some contemporary Egyptologists who are now using this term mir, and they have now begun to refer to the pyramids as resurrection machines, which is a wonderful description of this ancient device. And so we now know, based on the latest research, they're continuing to find the remains of new Mir in Kemet, primarily in lower Kemet. And that we know now that there are approximately 120 Mir in Kemet. And the only place where you'll find a greater number of Mir is in modern-day Sudan, where the civilization of Kush, they had over 225 Mir, or pyramids. There's a basic difference between the Mir that were built in Upper Kemet and those in Lower Kemet, in that the Mir in Kush had a much steeper angle. They appear more like the so-called pyramidion of the Teknu or obelisk. It has a much steeper angle than the angle that we find on the Mir that we see in let's say Giza, the Giza Plateau, for example. There is also evidence that the Mir at the Giza Plateau and the area surrounding Giza were not just randomly built, but there's new research that has come out that suggests that these Mir were designed specifically to mirror specific constellations in the heaven. So we have two scholars, Robert Browder is one, I forget his partner's name, but they have put forth considerable evidence to indicate that the pyramids at Giza, the 10 pyramids at Giza, were designed to mirror the constellation of Orion. And the pyramids, or the Mir at the Giza Plateau, and researcher Robert Browder has suggested that those 10 pyramids at the Giza Plateau were built to mirror the constellation Orion, and specifically the 3 stars in the belt of Orion match perfectly with the alignment of the 3 main pyramids at Giza, the pyramid of Khufu, Khafra, and Menkaure. And when you look at the relationship of the Mir at the Giza Plateau and their relationship, their proximity to the Nile River, you see that it's almost a perfect match for the relationship between the constellation of Orion and its proximity to the Milky Way. In Kemet, they referred to the Milky Way as the river in the sky, the Nile in the sky. So there's a new genre of research, what is it? I'm blanking on the name, but there's this new field of research in which they're beginning to look at the alignment of temples, monuments in Kemet, and their corresponding relationship to specific constellations and celestial bodies in the heavens. And what we are now beginning to understand more fully now than ever before, that it appears that every temple or monument in Kemet was aligned to a specific celestial body.
Mm-hmm. Which brings me to another question in terms of what Western civilization has adapted or has benefited from Africa. And if we look at engineering, and probably the epitome of engineering would be the pyramids. I know I'm so impressed when I drive along these highways and see the engineering feat of the West in terms of turnpikes and etc. But the foundation of that comes out of Egypt, and without that foundation, we would not have this engineering feat that we see as we drive, and even the World Trade Centers. Can you speak on what has been derived from that gift that Africa bequeathed through its development, the foundation of engineering?
Sure. Well, what we can say with certainty is the first building of stone ever created by human hands was built in Kemet, and that was the step pyramid or step mirror at Saqqara, built, designed, and engineered by Imhotep for the king Zoser. That is a 19-story skyscraper that is still standing in Africa today. And that then set in motion a process of construction that the world has benefited from. For example, at Saqqara, we have a pyramid complex where we have the step pyramid, but there is a temple complex that is built within the confines of that area. And that temple at Saqqara is the first example known to man of columns, the use of columns in the temple. Now, they are technically classified as attached columns. They do not stand alone. I can only assume that they hadn't fully perfected the art of building columns at that time, but several hundreds of years later, that skill was perfected, and we see the first use of columns in Kemet before they appear anywhere else on Earth. We're used to, in this society, of seeing what we refer to as Greco-Roman columns adorning many of our government buildings throughout the land. But the important fact is that the motifs of Greco-Roman columns, Etruscan, Ionic, Corinthian, composite columns, those were derived from similarly styled columns in Kemet that existed thousands of years before the advent of Greece or Rome. So we can trace that technology back to Kemet. When we look at Khufu's mirror or Khufu's Great Pyramid, we know, for example, that from the time of its construction, approximately 2500 BCE until 1884 ACE, when the Washington Monument was completed, we know that Khufu's pyramid was the tallest man-made object on Earth. It was originally built to a height of approximately 480 feet, a 48-story skyscraper. It was comprised of over 4 million stone blocks, which weigh an average of 2.5 tons each, as much as a car. There are 5 stones inside of that pyramid, above an area that is now called the King's Chamber. Those 5 stones weigh 70 tons, as much as a railroad locomotive. We know today that mankind, with all of its technological accomplishments, does not have the equipment to lift a stone that weighs 70 tons. So there are numerous questions abound as to how this structure was built, and more specifically, why it was built. This is the only pyramid or mirror in Egypt that has rooms and chambers within the structure itself. All other mirror have subterranean chambers where bodies were interred. So it is believed by some that this particular structure had a special purpose. Some believe that it may have been used as a temple of initiation. Others suggested that it was used as an observatory in order to make specific astronomical observations. The heliacal rising of Sirius, the transiting of pole stars, and other things. But what is clear is that this structure was built by skilled laborers, architects, engineers, and not slaves, as some would have us believe. There's no evidence whatsoever to substantiate the lie that Khufu's pyramid was built by slaves. We know the name of the architect who designed this structure. They have recently found the graveyard where many of the men who built this structure were buried, and it's in close proximity to the Giza Plateau. They have lists of the wages that were paid the men who built this structure. So for someone to say that slaves must have built this structure, someone who is looking back on this structure 5,000 or 6,000 years after it was constructed, who has no knowledge of that, would be the equivalent of someone 5,000 years from now looking back on the World Trade Center or the Sears Tower in Chicago or any other so-called skyscraper, and because of the absence of knowledge, believing that slaves built those structures. We have to realize that it takes a great deal of skill to organize tens of thousands of people working many, many years to build a structure such as that, and you don't have that degree of construction and engineering with slaves. Again, we are getting closer to finding more information about the builders of these structures and the workers of these structures, and that may hopefully help us better understand the workings of this great nation.
Now, we're talking about engineering, but before engineering, you have to have mathematics.
Exactly.
So I'm just trying to lay out that which the Western society, the Western world has benefit from the gift of the Nile Valley. And I wanted you to just briefly, I'm going to go through a lot of these, I hope you don't mind. In terms of mathematics, what we use every day, which is the foundation of all structure.
Sure. Well, math is not only the foundation of architecture and engineering, it's the foundation for astronomy. The people of Kemet were able to accurately predict eclipses. They were able to accurately predict the motion of celestial bodies in the sky. They were the first people to give us a calendar of 365 and a quarter days. They knew that the earth was round. They knew the orbit of the earth. They knew of at least 5 planets. They knew of the rising, the transiting, and the setting of many stars and numerous constellations. And they understood that these bodies, these heavenly bodies, moved across the sky in a precise mathematical pattern. So you have to have an understanding of algebra. You have to have an understanding of trigonometry. You have to have an understanding of geometry in order to build temples. Geometry, geo meaning earth, metrics meaning measurement, earth measurement. So you have to be able to understand the shape of the earth, the circumference of the earth, the distance from the earth to the sun. All of this information was known by mathematicians, scientists, engineers, astronomers in the Nile Valley. Now, the reason why these issues are not talked about to a large extent is because this was a indigenous African culture and civilization, and there are some people who don't believe that African people were capable of this quality of knowledge, and so these accomplishments have been attributed to the Greeks. But point of fact, Euclid is regarded as the father of geometry, but we know for a fact that geometry was used, the measurement of the land was used at the very beginning of the foundation of Kemet, because one had to be able to measure the land after the flooding of the Nile. In order to build all of the pyramids, to build every temple, you had to measure the land, survey the land. So this skill was used by Africans before there was civilization in Greece. The Pythagorean theorem, a squared plus b squared equals c squared. That formula was used in the construction of the Great Pyramid of Khufu. We know, for example, that what is referred to as harmonics, proportional harmonics, was incorporated into the design of every temple in Kemet. Proportional harmonics, or what's also regarded as the Fibonacci sequence of proportion. Fibonacci was the Italian mathematician who introduced this concept into Europe, but he derived this concept, this mathematical concept, after studying Kemetic math. And we see that these proportions, or this harmonic proportion, and the ratio of doorways to temples, and the ratio of rooms inside of the temples to each other, or the ratio of the expansion of the construction of temples followed a precise harmonic formula.
We're talking about harmony.
Harmony. It was in specific proportion. So that proportion is regarded as a harmonic proportion because it is succinct. It is melodic. It is art. It is art, and so we find that this understanding of building to certain scales exists in nature. We find the same harmonic proportion in the ratio of the cones on a pine cone. We find that same harmonic proportion in the spirals of a sunflower. We find that same proportion in the chambers of a nautilus. So it was known by the ancient Kemites that the Creator, God, the Neteru, builds elements within nature that follow a specific harmonic proportion. And that proportion not only adds beauty, but it adds strength and durability to that object when you follow that proportion. So this divine proportion was used in the construction of every major temple in Kemet. Now this was knowledge that Schwaller de Lubbock's really first brought to light, and traditional Egyptologists I think are afraid to embrace this, because if they begin to embrace this reality, then it means that they have to reevaluate their assessment of the people of ancient Kemet, and that becomes even more frightening as scholars begin to provide evidence to substantiate that Kemet was an indigenous African civilization. So you're now attributing all of these marvelous things to African people who, for the last 500 years, the world has taught made no contributions to culture and civilization. So there are people who have a vested interest in minimizing or denying the presence of this knowledge in order to control our thinking.